Sarah Martinez never imagined that her steady hands, trained to save lives, would one day grip an assault rifle with the same precision she used to hold surgical instruments. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had always been the one people called when someone got hurt. Whether it was a scraped knee on the playground or a more serious injury from ranch work, Sarah had a natural ability to stay calm under pressure and help others heal. Her childhood was filled with stories from her grandfather, a World War II veteran who served as a combat engineer. He would sit on the front porch during summer evenings, telling tales of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the weight of responsibility that comes with serving your country. But he always emphasized one thing that stuck with Sarah throughout her life. The greatest honor in war is not taking a life, but saving one. When Sarah graduated high school, she knew exactly what she wanted to do. While her classmates were heading off to college or starting jobs in the local oil industry, Sarah enlisted in the Army with one clear goal in mind: to become a combat medic. Her family was proud, but worried. Her mother cried the day she left for basic training, not because she disagreed with Sarah's choice, but because she knew her daughter's heart was too big for the harsh realities of military life. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston was everything Sarah expected and more. The physical demands pushed her to limits she never knew existed, but it was the medical training that truly ignited her passion. She learned advanced first aid, trauma care, and battlefield medicine. Her instructors were impressed by her natural abilities and her unwavering dedication to the principle that every life was worth saving, regardless of which side of the conflict they were on. During her specialized combat medic training, Sarah met other soldiers who shared her commitment to healing rather than harming. They formed a tight-knit group, supporting each other through the rigorous coursework and practical exercises. Sarah excelled in every area, from treating gunshot wounds under simulated fire to managing medical supplies in austere environments. Her instructors noted that she had an unusual ability to remain completely focused during high-stress situations, a trait that would prove invaluable in the months to come. The Army's doctrine was clear about the role of combat medics. They were non-combatants under the Geneva Convention, identifiable by the Red Cross on their uniforms and equipment. Their primary mission was to provide medical care to wounded soldiers, not to engage the enemy. Sarah embraced this role completely, seeing herself as a guardian angel whose mission was to preserve life in the midst of chaos and destruction. After completing her training, Sarah was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, which was preparing for deployment to Afghanistan. The unit was based at Fort Stewart in Georgia, and Sarah spent the final months before deployment training with her squad and building the relationships that would be crucial during combat operations. She quickly became known as someone her fellow soldiers could depend on, not just for medical care, but for her calm presence and positive attitude. Her squad leader, Sergeant Mike Thompson, was initially skeptical about having a female medic in his unit. He had seen combat before and knew how brutal and unpredictable it could be. However, Sarah's competence and dedication quickly won him over. During training exercises, she demonstrated time and again that she could perform under pressure and that her gender was irrelevant when it came to saving lives. The weeks leading up to deployment were filled with final preparations, farewell gatherings, and the inevitable anxiety that comes with knowing you're about to enter a war zone. Sarah spent her last evening at home with her family, reassuring them that her job was to heal, not to fight. She promised her mother that she would follow the rules, stay safe, and come home in one piece. Her grandfather pulled her aside that final night and gave her his old medic bag from World War II, along with a piece of advice that would echo in her mind during the darkest moments ahead. Sometimes saving lives means making impossible choices. As Sarah boarded the plane for Afghanistan, she carried with her all the training, values, and expectations that had shaped her identity as a combat medic. She believed deeply in her mission and in the clear moral boundaries that separated her role from that of the combat soldiers around her. She had no way of knowing that in just a few short months, those boundaries would be tested in ways she never could have imagined, and that the ambush waiting for her unit would challenge everything she thought she knew about the nature of healing and fighting in war. The scorching heat of Kandahar province hit Sarah like a wall when she stepped off the transport plane. The air was thick with dust and the smell of jet fuel, and the landscape stretched endlessly in shades of brown and tan under the relentless Afghan sun. Forward Operating Base Chapman would be her home for the next 12 months. A fortified compound surrounded by concrete barriers, razor wire, and guard towers that stood as reminders of the constant threat that existed beyond the perimeter. Sarah's first few weeks in Afghanistan were spent adjusting to the rhythm of deployment life. She worked in the base medical facility, treating everything from heat exhaustion to routine injuries. The work was steady but not overwhelming, and she began to feel comfortable in her role. The other medics on base welcomed her warmly, sharing stories and advice about treating combat casualties. Many of them were veterans of previous deployments who had seen the worst that war could offer, yet they maintained their dedication to saving lives above all else. The base itself was a small city, housing several hundred soldiers, contractors, and support personnel. There was a dining facility, a small post exchange, a gym, and even a recreation center where soldiers could play video games or watch movies during their off-duty hours. Despite being in a war zone, life on the base often felt routine and safe. Sarah wrote home regularly, telling her family about the interesting people she had met and the rewarding work she was doing helping soldiers stay healthy and recover from minor injuries. Everything changed when Sarah was assigned to Alpha Company's patrol unit. The company commander, Captain Rodriguez, had specifically requested a medic for an upcoming series of operations in the remote villages surrounding the base. These missions were part of the broader strategy to build relationships with local communities and gather intelligence about Taliban activities in the region. Sarah was excited about the opportunity to get outside the wire and do the kind of field work she had trained for, even though it meant leaving the relative safety of the base. Her new squad consisted of 8 soldiers, each with specialized roles and responsibilities. Besides Sergeant Thompson, there was Rodriguez, the team leader, Jackson, the communications specialist, Williams, the heavy weapons expert, and 4 riflemen who provided security and reconnaissance. They were an experienced unit that had been working together for several months, and Sarah had to prove herself worthy of their trust and respect. The first few patrols were uneventful, but educational. Sarah learned how to move tactically through different types of terrain, how to read the landscape for potential threats, and how to work effectively as part of a combat team. The villages they visited were poor, but peaceful, with children who would run alongside their vehicles, and adults who seemed genuinely grateful for the medical care Sarah provided. She treated minor ailments, distributed basic medical supplies, and even helped deliver a baby in one remote village. During these early missions, Sarah maintained her strict adherence to her role as a non-combatant. She carried only her medical equipment and a sidearm for personal protection, which was standard for combat medics. Her uniform bore the distinctive red cross that identified her as medical personnel, and she made sure that everyone understood her primary mission was to provide care, not to engage in combat. The local people seemed to recognize and respect this distinction, often approaching her directly when they needed help. The intelligence reports during this period indicated that Taliban activity in their area was minimal. The local tribal leaders appeared to be cooperating with coalition forces, and there had been no significant incidents for several weeks. Sarah began to feel confident that her deployment would be relatively peaceful, allowing her to focus on her medical mission without the complications of active combat. This sense of security was reinforced by the positive reception they received in the villages. Local people would invite them to sit and share tea, children would bring small gifts, and the village elders would spend hours talking with Captain Rodriguez about community needs and security concerns. Sarah particularly enjoyed working with the village women, who were often responsible for basic health care in their families but had limited access to medical supplies or training. However, beneath this peaceful surface, things were changing in ways that Sarah and her unit could not fully perceive. Taliban fighters had been moving through the region, gathering intelligence about coalition patrol routes and timing. They had been watching Sarah's unit for weeks, noting their patterns and identifying vulnerabilities. The apparent calm was actually the quiet before a carefully planned storm. The Taliban commanders had specifically noted the presence of the female medic in the patrol unit. They saw her as both a valuable target and a potential source of propaganda if they could capture or kill an American servicewoman. They had also observed how the other soldiers in the unit positioned themselves to protect her during movements, which they planned to exploit during their attack. As Sarah's unit prepared for what they thought would be another routine patrol to a village they had visited several times before, they had no idea that more than 20 Taliban fighters were already in position along their planned route. The ambush had been weeks in the planning, with multiple escape routes prepared and weapons carefully positioned to maximize casualties. The Taliban had chosen their location well, a narrow valley where the patrol would have limited options for maneuvering and where help would be slow to arrive. On the morning of the patrol, Sarah went through her usual pre-mission routine. She checked her medical supplies, reviewed the route with the rest of the team, and studied the latest intelligence reports. Everything seemed normal and routine. She had no premonition that this day would be different from any other, no sense that the skills she had spent her entire military career avoiding would soon become necessary for her survival and the survival of her fellow soldiers. The morning sun was just beginning to burn away the early desert chill when Sarah's patrol convoy rolled out through the main gate of Forward Operating Base Chapman. It was supposed to be a routine mission, a visit to a village called Kala Isha that they had been to 3 times before without incident. The villagers there had been cooperative, and the local elder had specifically requested medical assistance for several sick children and elderly residents who couldn't make the journey to the base. Sarah rode in the second vehicle of the 3-truck convoy, positioned between the lead vehicle with Sergeant Thompson and the trail vehicle carrying the heavy weapons team. Her medical bag was secure beside her, fully stocked with 4 fluids, bandages, medications, and the various supplies she might need for treating combat casualties. Despite the routine nature of the mission, she had prepared for any possibility, a habit that had been drilled into her during training. The route to Kala Isha took them through a winding valley that rose gradually into the foothills of the Hindu Kush Mountains. The landscape was stark but beautiful, with ancient terraced fields carved into the hillsides and small streams that provided life to scattered patches of green vegetation. Sarah had grown to appreciate the rugged beauty of Afghanistan during her months of deployment, finding it very different from, but equally impressive as the rolling hills of her Texas homeland. As they drove deeper into the valley, the radio chatter between vehicles was light and casual. Jackson was providing regular position updates to the base, while the drivers discussed the best route through some recent washouts in the road. Sarah was reviewing her notes about the medical cases she expected to treat in the village when Sergeant Thompson's voice suddenly cut through the radio static with urgency she had never heard from him before. Contact left. Contact left. We've got multiple shooters in the rocks. The world exploded into chaos in an instant. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles echoed off the valley walls as bullets shattered the windshield of Sarah's vehicle and sparked off the armored plating. The driver, Specialist Morrison, immediately swerved toward cover while the gunner in the turret began returning fire with a mounted machine gun. Sarah instinctively dropped low in her seat, her medical training taking over as she began mentally preparing for the casualties she knew were coming. The ambush had been carefully planned and perfectly executed. Taliban fighters were positioned in an L-shaped formation along both sides of the valley, with the heaviest concentration of fire coming from elevated positions in the rocky outcroppings. Rocket-propelled grenades began impacting around the vehicles, and Sarah could hear the distinctive whistle of mortars being launched from somewhere deeper in the valley. Sergeant Thompson's voice came over the radio again, strained but controlled. Lead vehicle is immobilized. We've got casualties up here. Sarah's heart raced as she realized that her skills would be needed immediately, but first she had to survive long enough to reach the wounded soldiers. The enemy fire was so intense that movement between vehicles would be extremely dangerous, possibly suicidal. Captain Rodriguez, riding in Sarah's vehicle, was coordinating the response over multiple radio frequencies. He was calling for close air support, requesting immediate medical evacuation capabilities, and tried to establish contact with a quick reaction force back at the base. However, Sarah could tell from the tone of his voice that help was at least 30 minutes away, far too long for soldiers who might be bleeding to death in the lead vehicle. The firing seemed to intensify as the Taliban fighters realized they had successfully stopped the convoy. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different positions, and the incoming fire was so heavy that it was impossible for anyone to move in the open. Her vehicle was taking repeated hits, and she knew it was only a matter of time before something critical was damaged or someone was seriously wounded. It was then that Sarah heard Sergeant Thompson's voice over the radio, weaker than before and with an edge of desperation. "We need the medic up here now. Rodriguez is hit bad, and so is Williams. I don't know how much longer they can hang on." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized that two of her fellow soldiers were dying less than 50 meters away, and there was no way for her to reach them safely. Captain Rodriguez looked at Sarah with grim determination. "I'm going to try to lay down covering fire so you can get to them," he said. "But you need to know that this is going to be dangerous as hell. Are you ready for this?" Sarah nodded without hesitation, even though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Everything in her training had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of actual combat. As she prepared to leave the relative safety of her vehicle, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She looked at the assault rifle mounted next to her seat, a weapon she had been trained to use, but had never expected to fire in anger. The radio crackled with another urgent call from Sergeant Thompson. "They're flanking us from the right. We can't hold them off much longer." Sarah realized with crystal clarity that her fellow soldiers were not just wounded, they were about to be overrun. If she was going to save their lives, she would need to do more than just provide medical care. She would need to help fight off the attack that threatened to kill them all. Her hands shook as she reached for the rifle, knowing that picking it up would cross a line she had never imagined crossing, but also knowing that sometimes saving lives required taking them. The red cross on her uniform suddenly felt like a weight pressing down on her chest as she prepared to become something she had never wanted to be, a combat medic who would have to choose between her principles and her brothers in arms. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the assault rifle, feeling its unfamiliar weight despite countless hours of training. The weapon felt foreign in her hands that had been dedicated to healing, not killing. But Sergeant Thompson's increasingly desperate radio calls made it clear that her fellow soldiers would die if she didn't act immediately. The Taliban fighters were closing in on the disabled lead vehicle, and time was running out. Taking a deep breath, Sarah kicked open the door of her vehicle and sprinted toward the lead truck under a hail of gunfire. Captain Rodriguez and the other soldiers in her vehicle provided covering fire, their weapons chattering as they tried to suppress the enemy positions. Bullets kicked up dust around Sarah's feet, and she could hear the supersonic crack of rounds passing close to her head, but she kept running, driven by the knowledge that Rodriguez and Williams were bleeding to death ahead. The 50-meter dash felt like an eternity, but Sarah reached the disabled vehicle and dove behind it just as a rocket-propelled grenade exploded where she had been running moments before. The lead truck was riddled with bullet holes, its windshield completely shattered, and smoke pouring from the engine compartment. She could hear groaning from inside, and immediately shifted into medic mode, temporarily pushing aside the reality of the ongoing firefight. Sarah found Rodriguez slumped unconscious in the passenger seat with a severe head wound and blood covering the right side of his face. Williams was trapped in the back seat, conscious but pale from blood loss, with what appeared to be a bullet wound in his abdomen. Both men needed immediate medical attention, But the enemy fire was so intense that Sarah could barely raise her head above the level of the vehicle's windows. "Sarah, thank God you made it." Sergeant Thompson was crouched behind the front of the vehicle, his rifle barrel glowing from sustained firing. "They're trying to flank us from both sides. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they get close enough to finish us off." His words sent a chill through Sarah as she realized that providing medical care wouldn't matter if they were all dead. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah began treating Rodriguez's head wound while keeping low to avoid the continuous stream of bullets passing overhead. She applied pressure bandages and started in 4-line, knowing that he needed immediate surgical intervention that she couldn't provide in the middle of a firefight. Williams was conscious enough to help by applying pressure to his own wound while Sarah worked on Rodriguez, but she could see that he was weakening rapidly. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Through gaps in the vehicle, Sarah could see Taliban fighters moving through the rocks on both sides of the valley, working their way closer to the convoy's position. The enemy had superior numbers and better positioning, and it was becoming clear that the patrol was in serious danger of being overrun before help could arrive. It was at that moment that Sarah heard the distinctive sound of enemy fighters calling to each other in Pashto from a position less than 30 meters away. Sergeant Thompson's ammunition was running low, and she could see the exhaustion and desperation in his eyes. "I can't hold them off much longer," he said grimly. "When they rush our position, you need to be ready to fight back, or we're all dead." Sarah looked at the rifle lying beside her medical supplies and felt the weight of an impossible decision. Everything in her training and personal beliefs told her that her mission was to heal, not to harm. The Red Cross on her uniform was supposed to protect her and identify her as a non-combatant. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. If she didn't help fight back, the wounded soldiers she was treating would be killed, along with everyone else in the patrol. The sound of approaching footsteps in the gravel made the decision for her. Sarah grabbed the assault rifle and positioned herself where she could provide covering fire while still monitoring her patients. When the first Taliban fighter appeared around the side of the vehicle, rifle raised and aimed at Sergeant Thompson's position, Sarah didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger, and the enemy fighter dropped to the ground. The sensation of taking a life was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. There was no satisfaction or triumph, only a hollow feeling in her stomach, and the knowledge that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. But there was no time to process these emotions because more fighters were advancing on their position, and Rodriguez was still unconscious while Williams was growing weaker by the minute. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah found herself alternating between providing medical care and engaging enemy fighters. She would apply pressure to a wound, then grab her rifle to return fire at advancing Taliban positions. She started in 4 while bullets shattered the vehicle's windows above her head, then had to stop to reload her weapon when another wave of fighters tried to rush their position. The dichotomy was surreal and horrifying. The same hands that were trained to preserve life were now taking lives to protect the lives of her patients and fellow soldiers. Sarah felt like she was being torn in two, but she continued to do both jobs with grim determination. Every time she fired her weapon, she thought about her grandfather's words about the greatest honor being saving a life, not taking one. But she also realized that sometimes saving lives required impossible choices. The arrival of Apache helicopters marked the turning point in the battle. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of their rotor blades echoing off the valley walls, followed by the devastating firepower of their cannon and missiles as they engaged the Taliban positions. The enemy fire began to slacken as fighters broke contact and retreated deeper into the mountains, knowing they couldn't stand against American air power. As the immediate threat diminished, Sarah was able to focus more completely on her medical duties. She worked frantically to stabilize Rodriguez and Williams while waiting for the medical evacuation helicopter that was already en route to their position. Both men were still alive, though their conditions remained critical, and Sarah knew that her quick medical intervention had probably saved their lives. But As she worked over her patients, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the enemy fighters she had killed. She had become something she never wanted to be, a healer who had taken lives. The weight of that contradiction would stay with her long after the physical wounds of the ambush had healed. The medical evacuation helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, its crew immediately jumping into action to load Rodriguez and Williams aboard. Sarah accompanied her patients during the short flight back to the base, continuing to monitor their vital signs and administer treatment during the bumpy ride. Both men were rushed into emergency surgery as soon as they arrived, leaving Sarah standing alone outside the medical facility, still covered in their blood and dust from the ambush. The immediate aftermath of combat was something no amount of training had prepared Sarah for. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and she found herself jumping at sudden noises that reminded her of gunfire. The adrenaline that had sustained her during the firefight was wearing off, leaving behind a crushing emotional weight that threatened to overwhelm her. She had saved 2 lives that day, but she had also taken at least 2 others, and reconciling those facts felt impossible. Sergeant Thompson found Sarah sitting alone in the base chapel several hours later, staring at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. He sat down beside her without saying anything, understanding that sometimes presence was more important than words. Both of them had been through debriefing sessions with intelligence officers and medical personnel, but the formal processes couldn't address the deeper questions that Sarah was struggling with. "I keep thinking about what my grandfather told me," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said the greatest honor in war was saving a life, not taking one. But today I did both, and I don't know how to live with that contradiction." Sergeant Thompson nodded slowly, recognizing the moral injury that many combat veterans carried, but few talked about openly. "You know what I think your grandfather would say if he was here right now?" Thompson asked quietly. "He'd tell you that you did exactly what you had to do to save your brothers. Rodriguez and Williams are alive right now because you were willing to be more than just a medic when the situation demanded it. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of." The weeks following the ambush were challenging for Sarah in ways she hadn't expected. Rodriguez recovered from his head injury with no permanent damage, though he would carry scars for the rest of his life. Williams required multiple surgeries to repair internal damage from his abdominal wound, but doctors expected him to make a full recovery. Both men credited Sarah with saving their lives, but she struggled to accept their gratitude. News of the ambush and Sarah's actions spread throughout the base and eventually reached higher levels of command. Military leadership was initially uncertain about how to handle the situation. Combat medics were supposed to be non-combatants, but Sarah's decision to take up arms in defense of her patients had clearly saved lives. The incident raised complex questions about the role of medical personnel in combat situations. After several weeks of investigation and consultation with military lawyers, command decided that Sarah's actions were justified under the principle of self-defense and defense of patients under her care. She was officially commended for her actions and her commitment to her fellow soldiers, though the commendation was kept relatively quiet to avoid setting precedents that might complicate the protected status of military medical personnel in future conflicts. Sarah's relationship with her medical duties became more complicated after the ambush. She continued to excel at providing medical care, but she found herself constantly scanning for threats and thinking tactically about how to protect her patients and herself in hostile situations. The clear moral boundaries that had once defined her role had become blurred, and she struggled to find her footing in this new reality. The psychological impact of the ambush extended beyond Sarah's immediate circle. Other medics on the base began asking difficult questions about their own roles and responsibilities. If Sarah could be forced into a combat situation, what did that mean for the rest of them? Some medical personnel began requesting additional combat training, while others reaffirmed their commitment to non-combatant status. The incident sparked debates that would continue long after the deployment ended. As her tour in Afghanistan drew to a close, Sarah found herself changed in fundamental ways by the experience. She had always seen the world in clear categories: healers and warriors, medical personnel, and combatants, saving lives and taking lives. The ambush had forced her to realize that reality was more complex and that sometimes the categories people used to organize their understanding of the world were inadequate for dealing with impossible situations. The flight home to the United States was bittersweet for Sarah. She was eager to see her family and return to a peaceful environment, but she also knew that she was bringing back experiences and memories that would be difficult to share with people who had never been in combat. The young woman who had deployed to Afghanistan with clear moral certainties was returning as someone who understood that sometimes doing the right thing required making choices that couldn't be easily categorized as right or wrong. Her grandfather was waiting at the airport when Sarah arrived home, and she could see in his eyes that he understood the weight she was carrying without her having to explain it. During their first conversation after her return, he told her something that helped her begin to make peace with her experiences. The hardest part about serving in war is not that you have to make impossible choices, but that you have to live with them afterward. The measure of a person is not whether they avoid those choices, but how they carry the weight of them. Years later, Sarah would go on to become a physician, specializing in emergency medicine, where her ability to remain calm under pressure and make quick decisions continued to save lives. She never spoke publicly about the ambush, but she carried the lessons from that day throughout her medical career. She had learned that healing and protecting sometimes required the same person to do both, and that the greatest honor might not be in avoiding difficult choices, but in making them when lives depended on it. The red cross she had worn that day in Afghanistan remained in her possession, a reminder of the complexity of human nature and the impossibility of living in a world where moral choices are always clear and simple. She had discovered that sometimes those who are called to heal must also be willing to fight, not because they want to, but because the lives they are sworn to protect demand nothing less. W.